Euan Bayliss with a speech entitled When the Improbable Becomes Probable.
Mr. Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters, and most welcome guests. Perhaps had I known that I was in a room full of accountants and actuaries, I might have picked a different subject. However, despite the fact that my knowledge, or maybe lack of it, is about to become patently obvious to these gentlemen, I'm going to press ahead exuberantly as I can. So, I did a degree in mathematics. Now, how many people love mathematics? Yes! How few people love mathematics? Now, most of mathematics is all about things that are certain, proving that something equals something else, or proving that particular case works in a certain circumstance. But I'm going to delve into probability and statistics, where suddenly things aren't quite so certain. We're dealing with improbability, uncertainty. When I talk about probability in mathematical terms, the probability that something will happen lies on a continuum between 0 and 1. If you imagine 0 being over here near poorly, this is impossibility. Some things don't happen. You roll a die and you don't get a 7. So that is impossible. Probability is 0. On the other hand, over here is 1. Certainty. Something's bound to happen. If you toss a coin, you're going to get either heads or tails. It could be no other way. And then right in the middle, 0.5, evens. Toss of a coin. You could get heads, you could get tails. I'm going to talk about things that happen right over here. Things that are very unlikely. But how these things that are very unlikely can leave us confused, and how our thinking can be distorted when we think about them. A good example is the National Lottery. Has anybody here played the National Lottery? No? Or at least nobody's owning up to play. When I talk about probability, there's a concept called a Bernoulli trial. It's named after a mathematician called Jacob Bernoulli. And it's simple. Either something happens or it doesn't. Either you succeed or you fail. Either you roll a die, you get a 6 or you don't. You toss a coin, you get heads or you don't. You buy a lottery ticket, you either win the jackpot or you don't. There was an interesting theory I came across a little while ago, which is called prospect theory. And it deals with how human beings react to risk. And the two gentlemen who found this theory, who are Kahneman and Tversky in 1979, they worked out something quite interesting. When a probability of something happening is between around 0.25 to 0.3, this is 1 in 4, 1 in 3, humans are very good at understanding the risks involved. When the probability is greater than that, however, going towards 1, we tend to underestimate that probability. When it's this way, we tend to overestimate the probability involved. And I'm going to explain a couple of reasons, well actually 3 reasons why I think that might be the case. The first thing that comes to mind is something that I call visibility bias. And it's simply, if you see it, it becomes real. If it becomes real, then it seems more possible. The obvious example of that is when you sat in front of the television waiting for Match of the Day to come on, the announcer always gives out the lotto results. And then he says something very interesting. He says something that goes along the lines of, early indications are that there are 3 lucky winners of the jackpot tonight, each of whom will receive about £2.4 million. Nothing to it, you might think. But if he tells you that there are 3 lucky winners, then it's much easier for you to think, that could be me. If he told you that for every winning ticket there are about just under 14 million unlucky tickets who didn't win the jackpot, it might not seem quite such a good prospect after all. But the idea of visibility bias is all-pervading. If you think about the news, if you think about reality television programmes, you think about things like terrorism, crime, you think about the unlikely things that happen in life, because we're exposed to them, we tend to think they're more likely. The second bias that I think about is what's commonly known as the gambler's fallacy. And it simply means that the more you do something, the more likely you are to succeed. Or in other words, each failure makes success more likely at the next event. It's a bit like somebody betting on horses. They fail 4 times, and the 5th time they say, well, it's got to be my turn now. It doesn't work like that, unfortunately, because when we're dealing with these kinds of events, they tend to be independent one from another. So every time you have a go at the National Lottery, it's a completely new event. And the final thing I'd like to mention is something that I call hindsight bias. Something happens to us, or it happens to somebody that we know, and we think back, how likely was that to happen to me? What they don't see is the big picture, that when you've got millions of people playing the lottery, somebody is more likely to win than not. When you've got an awful lot of cars travelling all around the world, unusual accidents can take place. So, I'd like to leave you with a story. And this is what got me interested in the whole idea of probability and risk. I was having a conversation with a chap called Alan on the internet. He's an American gentleman, I believe in Texas. And he was talking about, I believe at the time it was the neighbouring state had just brought in a seatbelt law, and he wasn't happy. He said, I don't like to wear seatbelts. I never wear a seatbelt. And I thought this was part of the attitude of government interference that sometimes you hear about in politics, particularly in America. But then he told his story. He'd been involved in a car accident a few years previous, and he hadn't been wearing his seatbelt. And something rather unusual had happened. He'd found himself in the back seat of his own car, and the driver's seat where he had been sat had been crushed. In other words, had he been wearing his seatbelt, he would have been killed. But the fact that he didn't wear his seatbelt means he survived. What's the problem is that he'd taken that as a general rule. Now I knew that I had all the figures and statistics to back me up in that wearing a seatbelt was better than not wearing a seatbelt. But I realised that what I was arguing against was personal experience. And then he'd taken that as some kind of fate, something that was bound to happen to him, and a sign. So, in ending, I would just say, beware of what you see on the